All right, so the question is mainly, I think, focuses on the stop loss. So let's, we just draw a line here to simulate our stop loss. All right, so let's say, we get into a short trade, somewhere around there, right? So we'd want the stop loss to start basically 2 VWAP lines away, right? So price it basically, right, is below the first deviation line, and so we'd want the stop loss, up here at the second deviation line, and then once price crosses another VWAP line, so this would be the VWAP center line here. Yeah, so once it crosses, then our stop loss will move down, right, to the next VWAP line, which would be two lines behind. Yeah. So if let's see if we can go back here. All right. Wow, the market's just been consolidating today. Yeah, today did not make any good examples. All right. So just to theorize here, right? So with price, being below the VWAP center line, then the stop loss would be, 2 lines above, right, or 2 lines behind. So, and then if price moves down, crosses another VWAP line, then again the stop loss would move down to the next VWAP line. So that way the stop loss is always two VWAP lines behind. So that's how I understand the trailing to work there. Let's see. All right, so the entry order doesn't matter here. The question really focuses on the stop loss. So let's just do a market entry. And the profit target is just going to be a simple 1.5 ATR. Although, based on my chart type and using the VWAP indicator, a 2 ATR profit target is too tight. It would never allow the stop loss to trail. So the target would get taken out way before the stop loss could even start trailing. So we will just leave the profit target out, and we'll just focus on the stop loss. All right, so we're going to start with a custom stop loss, I think, because I don't think there's anything in the quick list that comes close to what we're doing. No. Yeah, there's nothing in here that it would be close to like a VWAP or a pivot type of indicator. So let's just go and do a custom one from scratch. So in the initial placement, so to start, we have 2 options here. So we could start the stop loss at the third standard deviation line, right, or the outwardmost line of the indicator, right? So that could be the third deviation line below or the third deviation line above. So we could start our stop loss there. However, the issue could be that sometimes price might be outside, right? So in which case, if we took a short trade while price is above the third line here, right? So this is the third deviation line. So if price is above it and we take a short, well, obviously your stop loss can't be below, right? You need a stop loss above. So, so setting your stop loss at the third deviation line will not work in all trading situations. So what we'll need to do is we'll just have to set up, let's actually do this. I'm gonna clear out the stop loss, and let's just start with a simple ATR stop loss, or you could start with a fixed tick stop loss, whatever you want there, whatever is best for your situation there, but we're just going to start with one of these fixed stop losses here, and I'll just go with the ATR one, and let's see, I will increase it to 2 ATRs just to be a little more liberal there, right? And all right, so now we can get into the trailing actions here. So let's start a custom trailing there, like we did. And let's add a trailing roll. All right, so let's see, so the first trailing roll would bring the stop loss to the third deviation line, right? So we're going to start building these stop losses from the third deviation line out and work our way inward. All right, so this will be to the third standard deviation line. Right. So, so first let's kind of analyze here. So in order for the stop loss to be moved to the third standard deviation, right? So if it's a long trade, price needs to be above the second standard deviation line, right? And if it's a short trade, right, in order for the stop loss to be up here on the third, then price needs to be below the second standard deviation line, right? So to do that analysis, we're going to go into the trigger, and we're going to use price versus indicator. And that's exactly what we're doing, right? We're comparing price to the various, VWAP lines there. So let's see, let's check the closing price, right? And we'll compare that to the VWAP indicator. There we go. There's our VWAP. And again, I'm just using the standard settings there for the. Oh, actually, no, I'm not. That's right. I had tightened all the standard deviation multipliers there, just to bring my lines in here. So keep that in mind. There we go. And so if we're in a long trade, we want to compare to the second lower, and if we're in a short trade, compare to the second upper line there, right? So you have to figure out, which lines are we comparing, right, the closing price of the bar to. So again, if we're in a long trade, we're using the lower second standard deviation line. So, okay, so that sets up our indicator. So, but also something else that you might want to consider is, sometimes, right, we can see price comes down and it just barely crosses, right? It just barely crosses and then bounces back up, So you might want to consider, do you need price to cross the indicator line, by more than just a tick? Maybe you want, your bars to cross your indicator by at least 5 ticks, or maybe 10 ticks, something like that, right? So what we can do is we can add a tick offset. So let me Yeah, so I will add an extra 10 ticks, which on my chart is it's one range bar. So in other words, price has to cross the VWAP line by at least one range bar, right, to make sure that price truly did cross in and it's not just bouncing off or something like that, right? So anyways, whatever kind of, additional, ticks you want to add to that, excuse me for a moment. So, how much you need to add to your indicator obviously depends on the volatility of the market and, what type of chart you're trading on and all that good stuff. So since I have a 10 range pulled up right now, I'll just put in 10 extra ticks, which would be one whole range bar. I think that sounds good enough. Right? So I'm adding 10 ticks to the indicator. So as price is coming down here, right, what it's doing is it's taking the VWAP line and subtracting 10 ticks, right? Because, this would be like, right, if price is crossing down, then let's assume we're in a short trade, right? So for a short, right, it's a negative 10 ticks. So it takes the VWAP line and subtracts 10 ticks and then compares that price to the closing price, right? And so let's see here. So if we're in a short trade, we need the close to be equal or below the VWAP line, minus 10 ticks. Yeah, so both of these modes are set up correctly. The default is set correctly there. So that's how we can compare, price to an indicator and make sure that price is on the correct side of your indicator, with an additional buffer if you think that's necessary, right? And so in this case, I added a 10 tick buffer there. So price has to go an additional 10 ticks beyond the VWAP line, before this trigger becomes true. So now we have our trigger. So now we need to go set up the action. So the action is we're going to move our stop loss to the third standard deviation line there, right? So the mode, we don't want price, we want an indicator value. So, right, we want to set our stop loss to the VWAP indicator value there. And let's see here. So let's go set that up. Here we go. And again, I need to adjust the indicator settings here to match what I have on the chart there. And so now we have to figure out which plots we want to move that stop loss to. So if it's a long trade, it's going to be the third lower line if we're in a long trade. So if we're in a short trade, it'll be the third upper line. Yeah, there we go. Okay. There's no repeat here. Yeah, so once that stop loss steps up to the next VWAP line, that's a one-time action. So, okay, so there's one rule. And so now we just need to set up the other ones. All right, so now what's the condition for moving the stop loss to the second standard deviation line, right? So that would be this line or this line, right? So thinking in terms of a long trade, to move the stop loss from the third up to the second, price needs to be above the first line. So let's go into our trigger and set that up. All right, there's our VWAP. There we go. So now price needs to be above the first upper line for a long or below the first lower line for a short. There. And let's make sure let's continue to add our 10 tick offset right from the indicator. So let's see. Yeah, so there we have it. So now we're comparing the let's see, stretch this out a little bit. We're comparing the closing price to the VWAP first lower line. Let's see. Oh, no, I got these backwards. So for a long trade, it's the first lower line. And for a short trade, it's the first upper line. There we go. There. Okay. All right. So that is our trigger, right? The close needs to be above the first lower standard deviation line in order to move the stop loss to the second lower standard deviation line. And so now we just need to go into the action and set up where the indicator should be moved to. And let's see, yeah, so here we go. So BlackBird is automatically set up the VWAP indicator for us to save us some time here. And we can see the indicator settings are already in place. So now we just need to select the correct plots. There we go. There. All right. And let me see. Let me double check the trigger. The trigger for the third. Oh, okay, so here's the third. Let me double check the triggers for the third standard deviation line. Make sure I didn't reverse these, and yeah, okay, good. All right, so I didn't get those wrong. All right, so the next rule is going to be the first, moving the stop loss to the first standard deviation line, right? So these are the rules, that will move the stop loss to either the third standard deviation line or to the second standard deviation line or to the first standard deviation line, right? So that's what these names are telling us, is where, which rule, where the rule is going to move the stop loss to. So this rule is going to move the stop loss to the first standard deviation line, right? So in order for the stop loss to move to the first standard deviation line, where does price need to be? It needs to be above the center line, right? It needs to be above the actual VWAP line. So in our trigger, let's go and select the price versus indicator again. And then let's go into the indicator, go into it again. And there's our VWAP line. And set in, or adjust the settings, I should say, there. And so now, so now price needs to either be right above the actual VWAP line, or the center line there. So there's that. And let's put in our 10 tick buffer. And there we have it. So we're done there. And so now the action is we're going to move our stop loss to the VWAP indicator. So let's select the indicator value again. And we can see the order flow VWAP is already set up for us automatically. And we're just going to double check the settings, and they all look correct. So now we need to select the correct plots, just like that. So for a long trade, the stop loss gets moved to the first lower line. And so for a short trade, it gets moved down to the first upper line. So, all right. So there's that one. And so now, what if price keeps going higher? Well, then we would move our stop loss up to the center VWAP line. Right? So let's add that rule. All right, so we're going to move to the VWAP center line. So again, we're going to use our trigger is going to be price versus indicator. So let's go in and set up that VWAP. Here we go. So now for a long trade, price needs to cross above the first upper VWAP line, or for a short trade, it needs to cross the first lower VWAP line. Right. There's that. Set our 10-tick buffer there, and then the action will be to move our stop loss to the indicator. So let's go into the VWAP, and our settings are still correct. And now we're going to move our stop loss to the actual VWAP center line there. So, all right, that one's done. Right, so now we're kind of getting into a rhythm here. We're just, repeating the same steps over and over and over again. So let's just add another rule. All right, so I need something to denote the difference between, the previous rule names here. All right, so let's just continue to set up our trigger rule here. So price versus indicator. And let's go set up the indicator again. Go select the VWAP. All right, so now in order for the stop loss, for a long trade, in order for the stop loss to move to the upper first deviation line, price needs to cross the second upper deviation line. So we want the second upper, there we go, price for a long, price needs to cross above the second upper, and if it's a short, it'd be the second lower. So there we go. And let's add our 10-tick buffer, and we're done. So now let's set up the action. So we're going to move the stop loss to the indicator. Let's open up the VWAP, double check our settings, everything looks good. And so now our stop loss for a long trade moves to the first upper line for a long, and so it'd be the first lower for a short. There. All right, so far we have a rule. So, in looking at a long trade, we have rules in place that would move the stop loss to the third lower, to the third lower, and then to the second lower, and then to the first lower, and then to the center line. And now we just finished the one that would move the stop loss up to the first upper line. And so now create a rule that moves to the second upper line here. All right, add another rule there. All right, there's our rule name. So once again, let's set up our trigger. We want price versus indicator. And then let's plug in the VWAP indicator. There we go. So now, all right, in order to move our stop loss to the second upper line, price needs to cross above the third upper line. So there we go. There's our third upper line for a long trade. And of course it would be the third lower line if we were in a short trade. There. And let's add our 10 tick buffer again. There we go. And so now the action is, once again, we're going to move our stop loss to an indicator. And there's the VWAP indicator. The settings are still correct. And so now, let's see, for a long trade, our stop loss gets moved to the second upper line. And if it's a short trade, the second lower line. Yep. Don't. Okay, and that's as far as we can go, right? So in order to move the stop loss, to the third upper line, well, there's no more lines to cross, right? So, you'd have to figure something else out to determine, what condition do you need to see in order for the stop loss to move to the third upper line, So we'll just stop right there. And so now comes the fun part where we get to test this out. So let's see here. Let's save this out. This is pretty complex. All right. So obviously we have an entry order, which is just a market entry. There's no profit target, but we do have, but of course this is all about the stop loss. So our stop loss starts out as a 2 ATR, and then it will trail the VWAP lines. There we go. I think that's a little better explanation there. So it's trailing 2 VWAP lines behind. Okay, let's save that out. And nice, our VWAP lines are tightening up a little bit, so that'll make things a little easier. So let's go long here. And so there's a 2 ATR. Actually, you know what? Let me do something here. Let me push this. I'm going to push this stop loss way out so we can watch it move in. Yeah, it looks like I'm going to have to go about 10 ATRs out, I think. There, we'll just exaggerate that initial placement of the stop loss. So, all right, hit go long. So there we go. Hopefully you guys saw that. It was really quick, obviously. Let's try this one more time, right? So the stop loss is going to be placed way down there. Actually, let's do this. Let's fix my chart scaling. So if we go long, starts way out, and then boom, and then pops up to the third line because price is in between the second and the first line. And so now let's move the trend up, And so now we just kind of sit and watch. All right, so while we're sitting and watching, I could take a drink of water. All right, as soon as this bar closes, that stop loss should move up. There we go. All right, there's step one. Yeah, I have a feeling when this bar closes, it's not going to be, it's going to be just shy of, oh no, okay, it was 10 ticks off. I thought this bar was going to be just shy of 10 ticks above the center line, but our stop loss moved up, so it was not. All right, cool, so there we go. All right, so while we're waiting on the next trail, right, so yeah, so keep in mind, we're using an indicator, right, we're comparing price to an indicator. So, right, and BlackBird is operating on bar close. So you have to wait for the bar to close before the trigger, comparison is done, right? So in other words, this bar had to close, before BlackBird would compare the closing price of the bar to the indicator, right? So as soon as that bar closed, boom, our stop loss moved up, presto. So, all right, looks like, as soon as this next bar closes here, I think we're going to get another step up. And there it goes. All right, well, I think that concludes this question here. So let's just, do a little summary of this trailing concept here. All right, so so the concept is the same for any indicator, right, that plots multiple lines, right? So this concept would be the same for any pivot indicator, right, that has a whole bunch of pivot lines. We got the VWAP. I guess the same would be, if somebody had like a multi-banded Bollinger Band indicator, right? I know some people out there have made, have taken things like the Bollinger and Keltner and kind of made multi-banded versions of those indicators, right? So you got multiple bands. So the concept, is all the same across those indicators. So the first thing you got to do is figure out where does price need to be, which line, which plot does price need to be above or below, before you want to move your stop loss, right? So that's what the trigger is doing. The trigger is determining, it's comparing price, right? It's looking at price and saying, is price, above, each of these lines or below each of these lines, depending if you're in a long or short trade, right? So, and then, if price is above, a line, then you move on to the action, and then the action tells BlackBird where to move that stop loss to. So, right? So it's really just as simple as that. And then of course you just have to keep reiterating the same conditions over and over and over again, and of course just go from one line to the next line to the next line to the next line, so on and so forth, right? So, and of course with this concept, right, there is no repeat. Once you've moved an indicator to a line, then there's no repeating, unless, well, actually that's that's not entirely true. So, I did tighten up these deviation bands just so we wouldn't have to wait so long for price to cross them all. Actually, let me stop the trend there, right? So yeah, if you were using normal deviation line spacing, then, as we can see, well, actually the VWAP line, man, it sure doesn't look like it moves. Oh, there we go. Okay, if we tighten things up, yeah, we can see that the VWAP line does move very slowly. So if you wanted your stop loss to follow the line, maybe this would be more obvious if you're using a Bollinger Band, right, where the bands are contracting and expanding a lot faster, right? They're moving a lot faster than the VWAP line does. So if you were, if you were applying this to a Bollinger Band or something, or maybe a faster moving VWAP line, then you might actually want to turn the repeat on, set the repeat to, let's see, I guess, yeah, you would just set the repeat to indefinitely to keep it simple. That way, with the repeat set to indefinitely, right, if your VWAP line, starts to move a little bit, then your indicator, your stop loss would move up with the VWAP line or the Bollinger Band or something like that. Yeah. So, turning the repeat on basically might be necessary, depending on how much your indicator moves around. So obviously, if it was a pivot indicator, then the repeat doesn't need to be turned on because pivot lines don't move up and down like a VWAP or a Bollinger Band does. All right, so basically there's the summary, of what we did there. So VWAP or Vito is asking, can this be combined with two different indicators for trailing, such as combine it with the VWAP and the pivot indicator? Yeah, absolutely. You could create another set of rules here. So it depends on how you want to break it all down. If you're comparing price to only the VWAP, but then you want your stop loss to move to either the VWAP or the pivot, whichever is closer, well, I guess you would have to analyze, do the pivot and VWAPs line up really close to each other? So probably the safest thing to do is you would need an entirely, regardless, you would need an entire new set of trailing rolls, and with this new set of trailing rolls, your trigger would be comparing to the pivot indicator instead of the VWAP, and then your action would be to move that stop loss to the pivot line. Yeah, so basically you would just double the number of trailing rolls, and then instead of using the VWAP, for the second set of trailing rolls, instead of using the VWAP, you would use the pivot indicator instead, right? And just follow that same concept. So yeah, and remember, the evaluate using, is determining which trailing roll gets to move the stop loss, right? And so the evaluate using is always trying to find the action that's closest to price, right? So whichever one of the actions is going to move that stop loss closest to where the market price is. That is where, that's the trailing rule that will get executed. In other words, if your VWAP line is a little closer to where the market is versus your VWAP line, if your pivot line is closer to the market than your VWAP line, then BlackBird would move your stop loss to the pivot line because it's closest to where the market price is. All right, yeah, you're welcome, Vito.